Welcome to Wild HOA Situations. The fine meter started before I even grabbed the shovel. The tow hook chain swung inches from my car and Karen screamed that I had ignored 3 winter notices and today was the final action unless I signed her compliance form on the spot. This is your final winter compliance notice, and it is happening today. That is what Teresa King said, standing in the middle of my driveway at 7 in the morning with a tow truck idling behind her and frost breath billowing in my face. I live in Surprise, Arizona, which does not get snow often, but when it does, the Saddlebrook HOA board treats winter like a religious event. I work as a solar installation scheduler, so I deal with approvals and inspections every day, and I know what real compliance looks like. This was not compliance. This was a shakedown. Teresa shoved the clipboard closer. Smile, I am documenting this for the file. She said it with a grin that looked like it hurt her face. I glanced at the forms. Every box was already checked. Failure to clear sidewalk within 12 hours. Snow obstruction in street right-of-way. Failure to break up ice chunks deposited by HOA plow. I had cleared my driveway yesterday afternoon, right after the storm stopped. I piled the snow near the curb, same as every other house on the block. Teresa decided that pile was street obstruction and called a tow. I asked her to show me the rule. She flipped one page and pointed at a paragraph about emergency snow removal. I read it twice. It said nothing about curb piles. I told her that. She switched tactics instantly. The rule says we can interpret obstruction as anything that impedes traffic flow or emergency access. That is the standard. I asked who made that interpretation. She tapped the clipboard. The board. I am the record's custodian, so I know what the board voted on. The board will back me because they are afraid of me. I did not sign. I stepped back and pulled out my phone. Teresa called the tow driver forward. He was a middle-aged guy in a reflective vest, looking uncomfortable. I asked him if he had authorization paperwork. He looked at Teresa. She waved the clipboard. He shook his head and said he needed something from management, not just a board member. Teresa turned red. She told him to hook the car anyway. He refused. She started yelling about breach of contract. He got back in his truck and said he would wait for a proper work order. Teresa pivoted to me. Fine. You have 24 hours to move that snow pile and submit proof photos. Or the fine stands. The fine was $250. I asked when the board voted on that amount. She said it was an emergency assessment under the winter addendum. I asked to see the winter addendum. She said I could request it in writing and pay the records fee. $50 per request, plus copy fees. I knew that game. Teresa ran the records like a toll booth. Every document request got delayed, overcharged, or buried. I told her I would file an appeal. She laughed. The hearing is set for next Tuesday at 6. That gives you 5 days. Oh, and the forecast says another storm hits Monday night, so good luck. She turned and walked back to the tow truck, clipboard tucked under her arm like a trophy. The driver gave me an apologetic shrug and drove off. I stood there in the cold, watching my breath fog the air. My mental health had been fragile for months, and this harassment was pushing me to the edge. I could feel my hands shaking, and it was not just the cold. I went inside and made coffee. I needed a plan. The Saddlebrook HOA board had been tightening enforcement all winter, but Teresa was the engine. She controlled access to every document, every vote record, every policy memo. If you challenged her, she buried you in procedure. If you ignored her, she escalated to fines and liens. I had watched her do it to 3 other homeowners already this season. One guy lost his car to a lien sale over unpaid snow removal fines. Another family paid $5,000 in legal fees just to get meeting minutes that should have been public record. I called my ally, a local journalist named Marcus who covered municipal corruption for the Surprise Tribune. Marcus had been tracking HOA abuses for years, and he knew what proof mattered and what did not. He answered on the second ring. I explained the tow threat and the obstruction claim. Marcus asked if I had photos of the cleared driveway and the curb pile. I did. He told me to document everything with timestamps and to file a public records request immediately for the board meeting minutes where the winter addendum was supposedly voted on. He said Teresa would stall, but the stalling itself was evidence. I drafted the request and emailed it to the HOA management address. Then, I walked outside and took photos from every angle. The snow pile was maybe 2 feet high and 3 feet wide, sitting on the curb apron where every other house had their pile. I measured it with my phone. I photographed the neighbors' piles for comparison. I filmed a slow pan of the entire street showing zero obstruction. I uploaded everything to a cloud folder and sent Marcus the link. By noon, I had a reply from the HOA. It was not from management. It was from Teresa, and it said my request was incomplete because I did not specify the exact date range for the minutes. She needed clarification before she could process it. I replied with a date range covering the entire winter season. She replied again, saying that range was too broad and would require a special research fee of $150. I forwarded the exchange to Marcus. He called me 5 minutes later and said that response was textbook document obstruction, and I should save every email. Tuesday came fast. The hearing was scheduled for 6 at the HOA Community Center, a bland room with folding chairs and a long table for the board. I arrived at 5:45. Teresa was already there, setting up a laptop and a stack of binders. She saw me and smiled. "Smile, I am documenting this for the file." She held up her phone and took a photo of me standing in the doorway. I ignored her and sat in the front row. The board members trickled in. President, treasurer, secretary, 2 at-large members. None of them looked me in the eye. The president banged a gavel and called the meeting to order. Teresa stood and presented my case. She said I had repeatedly failed to clear snow in accordance with emergency protocols, and that my refusal to move the curb pile constituted ongoing obstruction. She pulled up photos on the laptop. They showed my snow pile, but the angle made it look bigger than it was. She also showed a photo of a street sign, claiming the pile blocked the view. The sign was 50 feet away. I raised my hand. The president ignored me. Teresa kept talking. She said the fine was justified under the winter addendum and that I had refused to cooperate with tow enforcement. She recommended escalating the fine to $500 and adding a daily penalty of $50 until the pile was removed. I tried to interrupt. The president cut my microphone. He said I would get my turn after the board discussed. If you are enjoying this chaos, hit like and subscribe for more wild HOA revenge stories. They discussed for 10 minutes. None of them asked me a single question. Teresa handed out copies of the winter addendum. I could see from where I sat that it was dated 2 weeks ago, printed on fresh paper with no board signatures. The treasurer asked if the addendum had been voted on. Teresa said yes, at a special meeting in January. The treasurer asked for the minutes. Teresa said they were still being drafted. The president called for a vote. 4 ayes, 1 abstention. The fine was now $500, plus $50 per day starting tomorrow. I stood up. The president told me to sit. I asked when I could present my defense. He said I had already been given notice, and that failure to comply was not a defense. I asked to see the vote record for the winter addendum. Teresa said I needed to file a formal request. I pulled out my phone and showed the email exchange. She looked rattled for half a second, then recovered. That request is pending research. You will have your answer in 14 business days. I did not play my hand yet, and she thought that meant I had none. I sat back down and let them finish. The president adjourned the meeting. Teresa packed up her laptop, looking pleased. I walked out and called Marcus from the parking lot. I told him what happened. He said the lack of board signatures on the addendum was a red flag, and the microphone cut was a procedural violation. He asked if I had recorded the meeting. I had not, but another homeowner in the back row had been filming on her phone. I did not know her name, but Marcus said he would track her down. Wednesday morning, I woke up to another notice taped to my front door. It was a new fine, $200 for failure to break up ice chunks deposited by the HOA plow. I looked at my driveway. The plow had come through overnight and left a frozen ridge at the end of my driveway, same as every other house. The notice said I had 24 hours to remove it or face additional penalties. There had been no board vote on this. It appeared out of thin air. I took photos of the ice ridge and the notice. I photographed every other driveway on the block. Everyone had the same ridge. I called the HOA plow contractor and asked if they were responsible for clearing the ridges. The dispatcher said no. That was homeowner responsibility per the standard contract. I asked for a copy of the contract. She said she would email it. I spent 2 hours chipping away at the ridge with a shovel and a metal scraper. My hands were numb. My back ached. I finished and took more photos. I emailed them to Teresa with a timestamp. No reply. That afternoon, I got a call from a property manager I did not recognize. Her name was Sandra, and she said she was the new interim manager for Saddlebrook while the regular manager was on leave. She had a forced smile in her voice. She said she was calling to follow up on my compliance status. I asked her about the winter addendum vote. She paused. She said she did not have access to those records yet, but she would look into it. I asked her about the ice ridge fine. She paused again. She said that sounded unusual and she would check with the board. I asked if she knew Teresa. She said yes. Teresa was the records custodian and had been very helpful during the transition. I asked Sandra if she had seen any signed board minutes for the winter addendum. She said she had not, but Teresa assured her everything was in order. I thanked her and hung up. That night, Marcus called. He had tracked down the homeowner who recorded the meeting. Her name was Diane, and she was willing to share the footage. Marcus also found something else. He pulled tax records and vendor contracts for the HOA, and he noticed the plow contractor had a 6-month agreement that included a damage waiver. The HOA was supposed to handle any damage claims from plow ridges or curb strikes. Teresa had been fining homeowners for damage the HOA was contractually required to cover. I asked Marcus how he found that. He said he requested the vendor contracts under Arizona open records law. HOAs are not fully subject to public records requests, but vendor contracts over a certain dollar amount are reportable to the county. Teresa did not know that, or she thought no one would bother checking. Marcus said he was going to write a story about the enforcement crackdown, but he wanted to wait until I had my trump card ready. I told him I was working on it. Thursday, I called a third-party property inspection company and asked for a winter compliance audit. I explained the situation. The inspector said he could come out that afternoon and document everything: snow removal, ice hazards, curb conditions, plow damage, and street obstruction claims. He charged $200. I paid it. He showed up at 3 with a clipboard, a camera, and a laser measure. He spent an hour walking my property in the street. He took notes, photos, and measurements. He checked the HOA covenants and the county code. When he finished, he handed me a printed report. Everything was compliant. No obstruction. No hazards. The curb pile was within county guidelines. The ice ridge was standard plow damage, not a homeowner violation. I had my proof. But I did not send it to Teresa yet. I wanted to see how far she would push. Friday morning, I got another notice. This one said the daily penalty had started, and I now owed $600. It also said the HOA had scheduled a lien filing for the following Wednesday if payment was not received. 6 days from now. The storm was forecast to hit Monday night, which meant I would be dealing with snow removal again right before the lien deadline. That was not a coincidence. Teresa was setting a trap. I called Sandra again. I asked her if she had reviewed the board minutes yet. She said Teresa told her the minutes were confidential pending legal review. I asked, what legal review? She did not know. I told her about the lien threat. She sounded surprised. She said she would look into it and call me back. She never did. That afternoon, Marcus sent me a link. He had found a leaked vendor spreadsheet from the HOA plow contractor. It showed a target list of addresses flagged for enforcement. My address was highlighted in yellow. So were 4 others, all on my block. The spreadsheet had notes in the margin. One said, high priority per TK. TK, Teresa King. She had given the contractor a list of homes to target, and the contractor had noted which driveways would get the worst plow ridges. It was coordinated. I forwarded the spreadsheet to Sandra and copied the entire HOA board. I wrote one sentence. Please explain why the records custodian is directing plow damage to specific homeowners. I hit send and waited. Saturday, nothing. No reply, no calls, no new notices. The silence felt wrong. Sunday morning, I heard a truck idling outside. I looked out the window. It was the tow truck, back again. Same driver. He was talking to Teresa in the street. She was pointing at my car and holding up her phone like she was showing him something. I grabbed my coat and keys and went outside. The driver saw me and shook his head. He said he told Teresa he needed a signed authorization from management, not just a board member. Teresa turned to me. Smile. I am documenting this for the file. She held up her phone and took another photo. I asked the driver if he had received anything in writing. He said no. Teresa started yelling. The lien is filing Wednesday, so the tow is authorized under collections protocol. The driver said that was not how it worked. He needed a work order from the management company or a court order. Teresa called him incompetent. He got back in his truck and drove off. Teresa turned on me. You think you are smart. You think you can stall forever. But the board will back me because they are afraid of me. I told her I had filed an appeal and provided evidence. She laughed. Your evidence does not matter. The board already voted. I told her the vote was invalid because the winter addendum was never properly adopted. She stepped closer. You cannot prove that. I smiled. Actually, I can. I pulled out my phone and opened the email chain from Sandra. I had forwarded her the inspection report and the vendor spreadsheet the night before, and she had replied early this morning. She said she reviewed the files and found no signed minutes for the winter addendum, no board vote on the fines, and no authorization for targeted enforcement. She was suspending all penalties pending a full audit. I showed Teresa the email. Her face went pale, then red, then pale again. She grabbed for my phone. I stepped back. She started yelling about data theft and unauthorized access. I told her the email was sent to me by the interim property manager, who had every right to review HOA records. Teresa said Sandra had no authority. I said Sandra was hired by the board president, so yes, she did. Teresa turned and walked to her car. She slammed the door and drove off. Monday night, the storm hit. 6 inches of heavy, wet snow. I cleared my driveway Tuesday morning and piled the snow in the same spot as before. I took photos. I measured. I documented. I waited for Teresa to show up. She did not. Tuesday afternoon, Sandra called. She said the board had scheduled an emergency meeting for Wednesday night to discuss the enforcement audit. She said Teresa had been asked to provide all records related to the winter addendum and the fines. Teresa had refused, citing confidentiality. Sandra said the board president was not happy. She asked if I would be willing to present my evidence at the meeting. I said yes. Wednesday at 6, I walked into the community center with a folder full of printed documents, the inspection report, the vendor spreadsheet, the email chain with Teresa, the photos of every driveway on the block, the plow contract with the damage waiver. Marcus had helped me organize it into a timeline so the facts were undeniable even to people who hate drama. I also brought Diane, the homeowner who recorded the last meeting. She had her phone ready. The board president opened the meeting and asked Sandra to present her findings. Sandra stood and explained that she had reviewed the winter enforcement records and found multiple irregularities. No signed board minutes for the winter addendum. No vote record for the fine schedule. No authorization for Teresa to direct the plow contractor. No damage waiver documentation for homeowners. She said the enforcement campaign appeared to be improper, and she recommended rescinding all fines and penalties issued under the winter addendum. Teresa exploded. She stood up and accused Sandra of incompetence, bias, and failure to follow HOA procedures. She said the board had voted in a closed executive session, which was allowed under the covenants. The board president asked Teresa to provide the executive session minutes. Teresa said they were sealed. The president said executive sessions could only be used for legal matters, personnel issues, or contract negotiations, and that fines and rule enforcement did not qualify. He asked again for the minutes. Teresa refused. The president turned to me. He asked if I had anything to add. I opened my folder and walked through the timeline. The inspection report showing compliance. The vendor spreadsheet showing Teresa had flagged my address. The plow contract showing the HOA was responsible for ridge damage. The email chain showing Sandra had found no vote record. The photos showing every other house had the same curb pile. I finished and sat down. The treasurer asked Teresa if any of that was inaccurate. Teresa said I was twisting the facts and taking things out of context. The treasurer asked her to clarify. She could not. The president called for a vote to rescind the fines and penalties. 5 ayes, 0 nays. Teresa was shaking. The president was not done. He said the board needed to address the unauthorized enforcement actions and the refusal to provide records. He turned to Teresa and asked her to resign as records custodian effective immediately. Teresa refused. The president said the board could remove her with a majority vote. Teresa said they would regret it. The board will back me because they are afraid of me. The president looked at the other board members. The treasurer nodded. The secretary nodded. The at-large members nodded. The president called for a vote. 5 ayes, 0 nays. Teresa was out. She stood, grabbed her clipboard, and walked out without a word. The room was silent. The president adjourned the meeting. I walked outside and called Marcus. He picked up immediately. I told him what happened. He said he would run the story tomorrow. I thanked him and hung up. Thursday morning, I got an email from the tow company. The owner had reviewed the incident reports and the vendor spreadsheet. He said his company had been misled by the HOA records custodian and that he was canceling the HOA contract. effective immediately. He also said he was refunding every tow fee and storage charge from the winter enforcement crackdown. That included my $250 fine and 4 other homeowners who had been towed under the same scheme. The total refund was over $3,000. Friday afternoon, the HOA attorney sent a correction email to every homeowner in Saddlebrook. It said the winter addendum had not been properly adopted, and that all fines and penalties issued under it were rescinded. It also said the board had retained an independent auditor to review all enforcement actions from the past year. The email specifically named Teresa King as the former records custodian and stated that her actions did not reflect board policy. That was the HOA attorney correcting Teresa in plain language, on the record, in front of the entire neighborhood. Saturday, Marcus published his story. The headline was HOA Records Custodian Orchestrated Winter Violation Crackdown. Internal documents show. He included the vendor spreadsheet, the plow contract, and quotes from Sandra and the board president. He also included a statement from the tow company owner, who said he regretted being used as a tool for improper enforcement. The story went local viral. The comment section filled with people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Sunday morning, I got a package in the mail. It was from the HOA management company. Inside was a formal apology letter signed by the board president and a check for $600. The letter said the board regretted the improper enforcement actions and the stress they caused. It also said the board was implementing new transparency policies, including public access to all board meeting minutes and a cap on records request fees. I deposited the check. I filed the letter. I sat on my couch and looked out the window at my driveway. The snow was melting. The curb pile was shrinking. The salt spreader handle was still leaning against the curb, right where I left it. I thought about Teresa and how she had been so sure the board would back her because they were afraid of her. She was right. For a while. But fear only works until someone calls your bluff. The funny thing was, Teresa had quoted the winter addendum penalty schedule at the first hearing. She said the fine was $250, escalating to $500, then adding $50 per day. But when Sandra pulled the actual vendor invoices, the plow contractor had only been paid for $200 per incident. Teresa had been pocketing the difference. That was the karma beat. She thought quoting exact dollar amounts made her sound official, but those exact amounts were what proved she was running a side hustle. The minutes contradicted her, and the invoices buried her. I heard later that Teresa tried to fight the removal. She claimed the board violated her due process rights. The HOA attorney shut that down fast. He pointed out that the records custodian was an appointed volunteer position, not an employment contract, and that the board had the authority to remove any officer at will. Teresa hired her own lawyer, but the case went nowhere. She moved out of Saddlebrook 3 months later. The plow berm at the end of my driveway became a kind of monument. That was where Teresa tried to direct traffic like she was a cop, where the tow driver refused to hook my car, where I stood with my phone and documented everything. That was the showdown location, and it was the spot where her enforcement machine fell apart. Every time I shoveled snow that winter, I thought about that moment. The chain swinging, the frost breath, the look on her face when I showed her the email. The neighborhood changed after that. The new records custodian was a retired paralegal who actually understood public access laws. She posted all the board minutes online within a week of each meeting. She capped records fees at $10. She answered emails within 24 hours. The enforcement crackdown ended. The daily penalties disappeared. The lien threats stopped. People started showing up to board meetings again because they knew their voices would be heard. I kept my documentation folder. I backed it up in 3 places. I never needed it again, but I knew it was there. That was the lesson. The HOA only has as much power as you let them take. If you document everything, follow the process, and refuse to back down, the paper trail becomes a weapon. Teresa learned that the hard way. Marcus won a local journalism award for his HOA abuse series. He used my story as the anchor piece, and it led to investigations in 2 other surprise neighborhoods. One HOA president resigned, another was voted out. The county started requiring annual transparency audits for all HOAs over a certain size. Small victories, but they mattered. I still live in Saddlebrook. I still schedule solar installations and deal with inspections. I still shovel snow when it comes. But I do not worry about Teresa anymore. She is gone. The board is different, the rules are enforced fairly. And every time I see a snow pile near the curb, I smile. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.